It's going to be very interesting also to look at things like F8C and F8A, military variant versus civilian variant, the Valkyrie versus the Asgard, 3 variants of the Hercules, C2, A2, M2. What's up friends, this is Manni and welcome to probably the biggest change to Star Citizen since I can remember. We have literally the entire game balancing changing completely, and what you're seeing here on screen is just a summary that I have made for you so you can understand what's going on without having to look at every single stat point change in these millions of numbers, because that could literally take 5 hours, okay? So without further ado, let's go into this. But first off, we have weapon changes and armor changes. And I'm making weapons into another video because it would be way too long, okay? So if we're having a look at the ship changes here, for example, you'll always find the total shield HP going down by 74%, but also the pilot DPS going by roughly the same amount. So all ships are losing, in the case of the Stinger, for example, instead of 9,500 shields, boom, only 2,500, right? So they're losing 70% of their shielding, somewhere around this, while also the DPS of all the ships is going down by a similar margin. However, I am very good at finding discrepancies, and I did find some in the stats changes. So for example, the Stinger, as well as some other alien ships, are getting the shield loss, but they are not getting the 70% damage loss. Some ships lose more damage output than others, okay? And it seems like the alien ships, Talon for example, don't lose the full amount. The same goes for some ballistic setups, like the Meteor, for example, doesn't lose the 70% because it's carried by this big ballistic cannon, and this hasn't been changed as much. But again, more about weapons in tomorrow's video. This video is about the armor. And like I said, I've summarized this for you so you know exactly what's going on without having to look at every item. Alright, and if you like that kind of thing, then stay tuned, subscribe to the channel. I do this all the time. I keep you up on everything Star Citizen, up to date. And also provide some other content like ship reviews and guides. Alright, so let's go with the Stinger. And I have listed the additional stat thing that it only lost 16% of its firepower in the default configuration. That is important to mention. Obviously, the weapon's changing, so if you change the weapons on the ship, you will change how the stats will go. But in the default configuration, it loses less damage output than the other ships, probably based off also the Wrath cannon that it has. That has a different change to it than other weapons do. And also, it seems like the Light Strike. No, this might be the bigger reason. The Light Strike, they barely change in this update, because the Light Strike was already really bad in the previous updates, so maybe they balanced it in the same path. Anyways, let's look at the durability and the armor that's coming in. With engineering, we also get armor. Those are the two big things now coming with the 4.5. And yeah, you'll see some differences. I marked all the ship changes in red or green, depending on whether or not they received like a buff or a nerf comparing it to their classes, right? For example, we're seeing the Stinger. The Stinger is probably the heaviest fighter you can get. It's as heavy as it gets. That's why it's so slow. But in return for that, it also gets the best armor ratio. So we're not changing the health of the ship, like the modules, by the way, right? The modules still stay at 47,000, as well as on PTU, as well as life. So the ship HP itself isn't changing, the armor is changing on the ship. And we're getting from 1,000 to 10,000. That is a 900% armor increase on the Stinger. However, wait a minute, it sounds like a 1,000% increase to me. Okay, anyways, we have, that's what they list in the stats. Anyways, the Guardian MX, for example, is a very heavy armored, or well, heavily HP'd heavy fighter, is only getting a 548% armor increase from 1,000 to 6,480. Okay, interesting to see is also the F8C Lightning gets more armor bonus than the MX. So the F8C Lightning gets to 7,360 armor. Now, remember that armor goes in relation to the weapon changes, weapons now having a certain penetration distance, depending on their size. And depending on the armor that they hit, this either makes a penetration or not, or it takes more or less of their armor away. So it's incredibly complex, but I just try to narrow it down for you as best as I can to give you an idea of how these ships compare in their changes. So this is 3 examples of heavy fighters. I'm not putting all of them in there. Let's look at some super small ones. Very important, the Arrow, very popular ship. This one gets a heavy nerf because it only gets a 56% armor buff, basically from 1000 to 1560. That is the lowest I've seen together with some other ships. Okay, so this is the Arrow suffers from this. It's a tiny little paper fighter, basically, doesn't have much armor, and it's being reflected in the stats. It's going to be very interesting also to look at things like F8C and F8A, military variant versus civilian variant. How does CIG do that, right? How do they see this? The Ballista and the Nova tank comparison, or the Valkyrie versus the Asgard, right? Super heavy armor military versus a bit of a more squishy, all-around kind of thing, right? Then we have Corsair and Taros, the 2 daily drivers. How do they compare? We have the 3 variants of the Hercules, C2, A2, M2, right? Also, we're looking at the Hammerhead being this massive armor bomber. Does it have that much after this change? We're looking at this. Starfarer Gemini as a daily driver. Very interesting. Then Perseus, Polaris, and Idris, okay? So, yeah, let's go back to the Saber. The Saber gets also a heavy nerf because it only gets 100% bonus to 2000 on the armor health. That is really not much. However, now let's come to the actual medium fighters. So we see the F8C, the civilian variant of the Super Hornet. No, sorry, the Hornet. And by the way, the name says Mark II here. That's also correct. It's the Mark II variant. The stats, however, listed in here have different names, and I have to figure out what they mean. Sometimes they have completely wrong names. Like, for example, the Perseus was listed as Andromeda in the change. I can show this to you here. When we go to Perseus, and we're going down to the armor changes, which was further down. Perseus, okay. Then this is not the armor. Here we are, and you see it's listed as Constellation Andromeda ship. But it says in brackets RSI Perseus. And this also reflects the size of the ship. Because generally speaking, the larger a ship, the more armor bonus it gets. That is like by default a common theme. But then, like I said, there are military variants and then there are civilian variants. There are ships that are meant for certain things like cargo hauling, distribution of items and stuff, or refilling. They do not get as much armor bonus as other ships that are made for combat, you know? And also, like I said, military and civilian variants, the F7A gets a 152% armor bonus to 2,520 as a medium fighter, whereas the civilian variant of the same ship only gets 112% with 2,120 armor points, right? So it's nice to see how CIG is now putting underlining the military abilities or attributes of those ships. We're looking at Ballista versus the Nova tank. The Nova tank should be heavily armored, and it is. It has, what does it have? I think it has a tremendous amount of HP. We've seen it recently here. Give me a second. I just want to make sure I get the number right. Wow, I really typed that wrong. Nova, here we go. It has 110,000 HP. 40, 40, and 30,000. That is crazy, right? Whereas, for example, the Ballista will not nearly get as much, god damn it, didn't have the same HP, only 24,000. So it was already, hit point wise, a much more squishy vehicle. With a different job. It's not as tanky, right? And now comes armor in, underlining this much more, because we see the armor bonus on the tank is 60%, going from 1,000 that it had to 1,600, whereas the Ballista gets a minus 52% armor nerf, going instead of 1,600 what the Nova tank has to 480. So it's losing tremendous armor, plus having lower amounts of HP. So you come in, you fire at the Ballista, this thing just goes down instantly, right? Also very important, and this goes across all changes, you see physical armor reduction stays basically how it was before, which means you hit a ship with your ballistic weapons, and you do 40% less damage, because they have a multiplier of 1 damage point being converted to 0.6 points of armor. Now, energy, however, getting a buff. Instead of the usual 1.0 or 100% or plus nothing, they get a 30% boost to their damage that is done to the armor. So yeah, this makes the gap between projectiles and energy weapons even larger, potentially nerfing projectile weapons heavily compared to their energy counterparts when it comes to how they deal damage to the enemy ships and vehicles. However, ballistic weapons get a tremendous amount of boost on their capacity of armor carrying. This is all part of tomorrow's or the next the weapons video. But just so you know what these numbers down here mean, that's why I had to explain this now. But yeah, so this is the difference between the vehicles. Now let's look at the Valkyries. I'm gonna call them Valkyries, but they're a Valkyrie and an Asgard. The Valkyrie being the more expensive, more heavily ultra-armored ship, getting from 1,000 to 20,000 armor. It's a 1,900% increase. Yeah, so that's how they say it. The increase is 1,900%, but it's like 2,000% of its original value. That's how you look at this, the numbers. All right, whereas the Asgard, being the more all-round daily driver variant, less focused on heavy combats and shot taking, only gets a 1,500% armor boost to 16,000 armor. So there you see the difference between these two ships, right? This is how CIG looks at these ships and understands their functions in a different style or way. The Paladin, you might wonder, it gets a 3,500% armor bonus increase, which is interesting because it is now, despite being at the same size of a Corsair, for example, much more armored. Because the Corsair is this squishy daily driver thingy, whereas the Paladin is a heavy combat-focused gunship, right? And you'll see this now in the armor being reflected. Having 36,000 armor points, whereas the Corsair only gets 12,000. How exactly the armor is distributed around the ship is something I'm not quite sure yet how this is going to work. We'll have to see some damage models about this, or I haven't seen them yet. Now, very interesting to compare Corsair and Taurus, because as we know, those are like the daily driver choices in Star Citizen. The Taurus being like the best bang for the buck, and the Corsair following right behind. And it's really just up to your visual preference almost, which ship type you're going with, because they're both such absolute insane daily drivers in their price to performance ratio. But the Taurus gets actually a little buff over the Corsair, because the Corsair goes from 1,000 armor to 12,000, which equals out to a 1,100% armor increase. Whereas the Taurus, even together with the Andromeda, get the same 1,500% armor bonus, so 400% more than the Corsair, getting to 16,000 armor HP compared to the 12,000 of the Corsair. Interesting, because the Taurus is actually cheaper. So giving the Taurus yet a bit of a better PL, or Preis-Leistung in German, PP, price performance ratio in English. So yeah, very interesting to see that, and also interesting that CIG does not differentiate between the warship Andromeda and the daily driver hauler Taurus. They do not differentiate here, or at least not yet. This is just the current iteration of all those changes. There might be some others coming, and this is always subject to change. Everything I do in these video analyses and stats comparisons, this is for the PTU. There's always the possibility of numbers changing. Typically, though, this is what's coming in. But I could see that they're changing this in the future, because the Andromeda is a warship and the Taurus is not, right? But yeah, so far, and also they do already, and that's something I guess where they might have the things. Andromeda is, if we look at this here, and we look at the Andromeda over here. Hold on a second. The Taurus. So if we look at those numbers, you see the Taurus already brings 140,000 HP, and the Andromeda 180,000 HP. So this is where CIG already says, okay, warship, not warship. But still, 140,000 HP is brutal, and there's no armor difference. Interesting to see, right? Now, let's look at these three. The C2, A2, M2. C2 is the cargo hauler, obviously. Doesn't care much about armor, and you'll find that here. As a very large ship, though, it still gets a heavy armor. you know, or it still gets a lot of armor around it. It's huge. It needs armor somewhere, you know. So for its size, it gets 36,000 armor, which equals 3,500% increase. The A2, however, is a military gunship dropship combo. It's, yeah, something like this. How do you even classify this? So, no, hold on. My mistake. The A2 is the bomber, is the heavy bomber, and therefore obviously being purely focused around military jobs. And it gets a buff compared to the C2 with 161%. Okay, forget the number that here, because it already had 20,000 armor before in this stat ranking. Let's say it like this. The A2 will have 52,200 armor, and the C2 only 36,000. So, big buff for the A2 compared to the C2, because previously the only differences were the shield and a little bit of HP. But now armor comes into the game, and the A2 will be much harder to shoot down than the C2 is. Not just because of the HP difference of that you can find in the ships in the previous patches, but also because of the armor. And the M2, which is a little curious, that's the one I described as a heavy gunship dropship. This thing is a little bit of in between. It gets to 46,000 HP, so it has much more than the C2, but not as much as the A2. Even though potentially the A2 bomber's job is not really to get shot, but rather drop a bomb and go away, right? Whereas the M2's job is literally land under fire, deploy troops, tanks, and vehicles, and get the hell out of there after, right? So the M2 is, like, from the job description, in my opinion, supposed to be taking higher risks than the A2. But obviously, the A2 is the prime target when both of them appear. You shoot down the A2 immediately, because that thing is going to be the one that's putting your troops on the ground in danger. And I've seen what they can do, man. That's no joke. So yeah, this is how it looks like. That's why I painted this orange here, because it's in between a nerf and a buff. It's kind of, actually it would also be green as a buff, right? But not as green as the A2. Now, Hammerhead, very interesting. Ship size is larger than the M2. So we have a 6,300% armor boost from 1,000 to 64,000. But if we take a look at the A2, the A2 isn't actually far away in terms of armor from the Hammerhead, dude. That is crazy. I expected the Hammerhead to get more of a boost in their armor compared to what it has now. Maybe we should even paint this red, because the Hammerhead lives from its armor. Its shields are bad. It has only 2 size 3 shields. That's not a lot of shielding for a ship that ideally is manned by 7 people. So for that, it has really a almost minimal amount of shielding, and it needs the armor to rely on. And it's getting a good amount, but it's not getting as much as I thought it was going to be. So maybe the green is the wrong color here, but let me know, guys. Anyways, let's move on to the Starfarer Gemini. And this is where I say, daily driver, my friends. This was already, and you might remember that I've made a video that I called the most underrated ship in Star Citizen as a daily driver. That is the Starfarer Gemini. 4 times size 4 in the front, tremendous ammo capacity, good maneuverability for some reason despite being this large ship, and it can refuel your friends. At the same time, it brings 4 size 3 shields, not just 1 size 3 like Corsair and Tauros do. And it has this double size 5 turrets that brings real fun to multi-crew aspects. And now, being a large ship, it benefits, on top of its crazy shielding, even more from the armor, because it gets a 2,500% armor boost to 26,000 armor, okay, being a larger ship. Looking at the Corsair, 12,000, half the amount of armor. The Tauros gets a little closer with 16,000, but 24,000 for basically just a little more money and more cargo, more shield, more everything. This might be the daily driver still that you're trying to look at. In my opinion, it's even a beautiful ship, but I guess tastes can be different. It's a military ship. The Gemini is a military vessel. I think maybe we should look at, let's have a look at the normal Starfarer, because the Starfarer is not a military ship, but the Gemini, hold on, let's go to the armor. This is Gemini. the relic, what does that mean? Okay, the Starfarer armor will be 25,000. And the Starfarer Gemini will be 26,000. Slightly different. So the military variant is only ever so slightly more armored than the none without the rockets. There's basically just refueling variant. Interesting to know. But yeah, still, this makes this the more interesting daily driver. And it gets a heavy buff, in my opinion. Then we have Perseus. The Perseus being in the same category as the Hammerhead. This, however, getting a higher armor. Very interesting, because again, the Hammerhead requires 7 people to operate perfectly. Maybe even like a jumper that runs around, fixes things in engineering. And then the Perseus requires only really 3 guys to man all the necessary turrets for most of its performance. And then maybe a jumper, so 4 guys in versus 8, right? And yet you have more armor on the Perseus. Very, very weird, in my opinion. 76,000 altogether and 64,000 on the Hammerhead. Now the Hammerhead has same amount of shielding, I believe. Both of them have 2 size 3 shields. So yeah, it's not that impressive for the Hammerhead. It's not looking as good. You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna unlock this now and I'm gonna paint this red, because this is clearly looking more and more like a nerf for the Hammerhead, which I think is very, very sad, because that thing really needs to be looked at. The amount of people you need to operate this thing, you should feel a little more powerful and more capable in the Hammerhead. And the Perseus, I think its shielding could be better, because its job is to fight against higher tier targets. So I agree with the armor buff. I think it's good. But I do also think that the shielding could be looked at if it's supposed to fight larger targets. 2 size 3 shields is a bit low on the shielding. Anyways, let's move on. Polaris. And this is the craziest thing. Remember when I told you shouldn't get the pure Perseus? You should get the Polaris instead, because the price-performance ratio is just astronomically different between the ships. There's only like, what, 160 or whatever dollars between them. And yet you have somehow 730,000 armor. That's not the HP, right? Just to make that clear, my friends, the Polaris HP pool lies at about 4 million HP, right? And if you ever played certain like games like World of Tanks, you know there is armor and there is hit points. If you have a lot of hit points and a lot of armor, that multiplies your armor so drastically. If you have a lot of armor but hit points but no armor, then you're just left with that hit point pool. Now the Polaris has armor and hit points, versus the Perseus basically gets just a bit more armor but doesn't have the hit points to support it. So you have 400,000 armor hit points on the Perseus and 4 million hit points on the Polaris. 10 times as much just raw hit points. And now you're also getting 10 times the amount of armor on top, multiplying that already insane HP pool to a complete ludicrous amount. So essentially you'll need a lot longer to shoot down a Polaris after after 4.5. And you need not really much longer to shoot down a Perseus. So I guess that makes the Perseus also a nerf, honestly. Compared to the Hammerhead, not so much, but compared to the Polaris, even worse. So again, Perseus is not worth it. And that is probably why I should go here and tell you guys, if you have a Perseus and you're really upset by the fact that the Perseus isn't working too well, there is currently, and still to this date, the possibility to save tremendous amounts of money upgrading from the Perseus to the Polaris. Because there are Warbound CCU upgrades currently available where you save $100. Okay? So if we're going on the left side, the Perseus upgrade, Perseus to Polaris, is only $75 right now. Okay? And of course it is more if you consider that the Perseus upgrade is currently also cheaper. Then you can say it's more than $75, but if you already have a Perseus and you're like, wait a minute, man, I'd rather be 10 times, maybe 20 times more tanky with the armor and hit point changes than the Perseus. Better multi-crew aspect also, a freaking hangar that of a crazy size. Like, this thing literally has a medbay. Everything is in there. This is the ideal ship. That requires, however, more people to fully man and operate, and with engineering, remember. But if you have some crew people, let's say you have 3 friends, 2 or 3 friends that you regularly play together with, you can do way more in the Polaris than in the Perseus. And this for $75 more. So honestly, guys, get yourself this upgrade if you are annoyed or uncertain about the survivability of the Perseus. However, another thing to consider, size 8 guns are gonna be important also in the upcoming games where the size of the gun determines how well you penetrate armor. Meaning that the Perseus with its guns is gonna be better at destroying a Polaris than a Polaris is. Just damage output wise, right? Not saying the Perseus will destroy a Polaris. I don't think that's going to happen unless you outrange the Polaris, outspeed the Polaris, you outplay it. Maybe that way, okay. But if you're just like brawling against it, the Perseus is just getting shredded to pieces and doesn't stand the slightest. It probably won't even get through the shields of the Polaris, okay? Although I guess it doesn't need to due to the ballistic cannons. But still, you don't stand the slightest trace of a chance against the Polaris with the Perseus, so you could make that upgrade. However, keep in mind, engineering, keep in mind, armor, weapon, penetration, values, distance, how much armor a weapon can penetrate based off its size, making the Perseus guns very special in the game going forward. So this is something you have to know before going to buy this upgrade. And in order to do a good job, which I always try to do, I have to let you know that as well, okay? So that's something you have going in the Perseus that's the Polaris does not have. She does have that nice double size 6 on the nose, but that's not size 8. And yeah, the Idris, well, I guess it just destroys everything, like with its values now. How much HP does the Idris actually have? I knew this once, but I don't know it now. The Idris has 15 million HP. So Polaris 4 million, Idris 15 million hit points. All right, and now let's look at the armor. The armor is being changed by 300,000%. When you thought that 70,000% on the Polaris is crazy, 300,000%. Yeah, this is a lot. Yeah. And it means that when you have 12 million HP that are also protected by 300,000% armor increase to 3 million armor, I mean, that basically results in an almost indestructible target at this point, unless you just really only hammer in with the biggest guns in the game and you somehow don't get shot back, which the Idris can do against the Polaris with its either the railgun or the laser beam. So you gotta be careful with it. But technically the weapons of the Perseus are the ideal choice against bigger targets, and that leads me back to the point where I say, hey, you gotta look at its shielding, right? At least this thing should take a few shots before its shields are depleted, because its job is literally to fight larger targets with those guns. But yeah, so this is the summary. I think you've gotten a pretty good feeling now for how CIG imagines these numbers to go in the future and the ships to look like, what their jobs will be and how they compare. This was a longer video, I'm sorry. I still tried to do a thorough job, but I did try also to summarize it for you so you don't have to look at every single number. So yeah, let me know what you think about this. Maybe also if I made a mistake somewhere, please let me know about that as well. Yeah, I'll see you in the next video when it's all about weapons, where I'm trying to do a similar good job to give you a very accurate experience or know-how about what the weapon changes will be without wasting 3 hours of your time trying to go through every single thing, okay? Have a good one. Manni signing off, and bye-bye, my friends.